Things looked promising after last week's talks between Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, Russian President Vladimir Putin, French President Francois Hollande, and German Chancellor Angela Merkel. But only days after the truce was meant to take effect, fighting continued along the front lines in eastern Ukraine. Joining us now for more, in New York City via Skype, there's Nina Khrushcheva. She is professor at the New School's Milano School of International Affairs and a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute. And with us here in studio, Marta Dychuk, professor of history and political science at Western University in London, Ontario. And we are happy to have both of you back on TVO tonight. Let me just start by offering up this graphic, which will sort of bring everybody up to speed since we're coming out of a holiday weekend here, and we want to make sure everybody's caught up. Here are the Ukraine truce terms. There was a ceasefire as of midnight, February 15th. A withdrawal of heavy weapons, creating a so-called 50-kilometer buffer zone. Ukraine fighters from the current front line, rebel fighters from the September 2014 line. A release and/or exchange of all prisoners, amnesty for fighters, a resumption of social and economic ties between Ukraine and rebel-held areas, and a move to enable local elections and constitutional reform that includes elements of decentralization. And just to give you a sense of what part of the world we're talking about, Sheldon, if you would, let's bring up the map. Here's the buffer zone. That's Ukraine, obviously, writ large. And here now the buffer zone that is supposed to come into place, the eastern section of Ukraine, in which the subject of the current ceasefire is at hand, and where the two sides are supposed to, I say supposed to, end up. Okay, Marta, that's what's supposed to happen. What's in fact happening?
At midnight on the 15th of February, Ukraine's President Poroshenko went on public television live and gave the order for Ukrainians to stop firing.
And did they?
So they did. Within a few hours, reports were coming in that they were being shelled. And in the first 24 hours, they were shelled multiple times. And that just continued. And things have deteriorated since. Deteriorated since.
Nina Khrushcheva, what would you add to that in terms of what's transpired since the ceasefire, so-called, was supposed to go into effect?
Well, I would add that actually fighting did stop in most parts of the crisis around Donetsk, around Luhansk, all these other places, and the fight did not stop around Debaltseve, which is now the main part of the disagreement, because the rebels were saying that Debaltseve was not part of the original agreement, because the fighting was already happening and was the original, or at least was already taken territory by the rebels. So they dispute that Debaltseve was part of the ceasefire and insist that they've been observing it in other areas.
Can I ask our director again, Sheldon, if you wouldn't mind, bring up the map one more time so we can see where Debaltseve is and why it is apparently so significant in all of what has transpired here. And then maybe, Marta Dychuk, I can get you to explain why this is considered an area of such significance that things would still be going on.
It's a major railway junction. And if you look at the map carefully, you'll see Debaltseve is in an area which looks sort of like a peninsula.
It's bang smack in the middle of this map here.
Yes, but it's a little peninsula that's jutting out. I'm not sure how clear it is on that map.
Okay.
And fighting around Debaltseve intensified about 2 weeks ago. So that was before the ceasefire negotiations proceeded. So that is Ukrainian-held territory that was being attacked. So as part of the ceasefire agreement, that is where, I mean, the ceasefire is supposed to hold everywhere.
And Nina Khrushcheva, how reliable do you think the information is that we're getting that's coming out of that area tonight?
Well, it's not entirely reliable because nobody can really get in close to this, so the reporting from the vicinity of the area. But it is reliable in a sense that, you know, one can hear, or people hear, shelling, and they've been reports on various deaths, and especially death by the Ukrainian troops. There is also a report, very brief report, that one of the Russian rebels was supposedly got wounded in an ankle and whatnot. So there's a lot of fighting indeed going on, but the rebels insist. And in fact, we might remember that the ceasefire was delayed 2 days after the Minsk agreement, the second Minsk agreement, because I think what Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, tried to achieve is he wanted the rebels would take over Debaltseve, so it would remain as part of the rebel territory rather than being disputed with the Ukrainians.
clearly, Marta, there's a lot about this ceasefire that is problematic, but your overall sense of it is what?
This is the third ceasefire, and we're seeing the exact same pattern. The first one was negotiated in June, and the Ukrainian side stopped fighting, and they kept getting attacked, so they resumed defending themselves and pushing back. Things escalated over the summer. Another ceasefire was negotiated in September in Minsk, and the same thing happened. Ukrainians stopped fighting, stopped shooting, they kept being shot at, things escalated again. And this is the third attempt at a ceasefire. But in Ukraine, they're saying this is not a ceasefire, this is one side stops fighting and the other side continues to fight.
You are clearly placing the blame on the separatists, the Russian-backed separatists, for the fact that this thing isn't taking.
It's not a question of placing blame, it's a question of seeing what's actually occurring and who's shooting and who's not shooting and who's honoring the agreement and who's not.
Okay, Nina, your overall impression of the ceasefire?
Well, it's working the way the previous ceasefires have worked, is that they would stop for a bit and they would actually, the ceasefire, it seems to me that the insidious part of those ceasefires is that they stop fighting a bit spreading further into Ukrainian territory. But we're also witnessing is that after each ceasefire, the rebels actually get more territory. And I think that Vladimir Putin is somewhat interested in continuing with the ceasefire or the pretense of it because he wants Ukraine as an independent entity, but he wants a leg in. It would not be as beneficial for him to have the rebels' independent area because then he would have to take care of it. They want to be part of Russia. But if Ukraine takes care of it, he has a leg in and he can actually spread havoc further. So I think that ceasefire functions, but in a way that Vladimir Putin wants it to function. Part military, part peace negotiations, but all around is a crisis.
So, okay, Marta, if I understand that correctly then, this is a ceasefire that militarily and politically works for Vladimir Putin, but not very much for Ukraine. Is that right?
Well, I'm not sure that we can say that the ceasefire is working if fighting is continuing. I agree that it's not continuing everywhere. But when you have mortars being launched and people being killed, it's not really a ceasefire. The whole purpose of a ceasefire is to get both sides to stop so that then negotiations can proceed on the other points of the ceasefire agreement.
But there's, I mean, with every ceasefire, I think theoretically there's supposed to be some give and take. It doesn't sound like there's equal measures of giving and taking here. Do you agree?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's one side stopping and the other side not stopping.
Okay.
And withdrawal, what was supposed to happen today is withdrawal of heavy artillery. And I don't see any evidence of that.
All right. At the beginning of this, we talked about some of the elements of the ceasefire, including the notion that there would be local elections and constitutional reform. And Nina, maybe I can get you to weigh in on that first. How significant is this ceasefire? Well, let me rephrase. What are the chances of any of that happening, given how the ceasefire appears not to be working very well so far?
I think that constitutional reform probably is not going to happen because we also have to understand that in some ways it's a very insidious plan by Vladimir Putin to keep his tabs on Ukraine, but not necessarily, but pretend that he actually has not invaded that country because, as he says, he has nothing to do with that. So I'm not sure that constitutional reform would happen. I would imagine that ultimately Putin will win in creating a conflict, a frozen conflict, which sometimes would be better served Ukrainians, less served Ukrainians. But I think that Ukraine is very much in a bind because they need to stop it one way or another, because Petro Poroshenko needs to get to the economic development of his country. He cannot spend more time on that. And so in some ways, as insidious as it is, it actually, Ukraine needs stopping that that war or that crisis more than Putin does. I don't think we can get constitutional reform. We may get some federalization. And also, I think another victory for Putin is that Ukraine may not necessarily will continue with pressing for membership in NATO, because this is something that would require much more work and much more peace on the Ukrainian side.
I mean, Marta, the fact is this is not a dispute between two equal powers. There's one power that's significantly more powerful than the other. Therefore, does Ukraine, in your view, has Ukraine done enough to lower the temperature, given that They're in a fight that militarily they can't win.
Well, if I could rephrase that question,
sure.
The bigger picture here is there's a country called Ukraine, there's a country called Russia. And Ukrainian territory is being invaded, and Russian military hardware, Russian-backed aggression is being perpetrated on Ukrainian soil. So we have a large power invading a small power. The small power has been asking the international community to intervene diplomatically, economically, politically. They have been engaged in negotiations. Until very recently, the Russian president has been denying any participation and trying to narrate this as a civil conflict within Ukraine, which there are separatists within Ukraine, undoubtedly, who are participating in this, but they're not the ones who started this. They're not the ones who are funding it or fueling it. So that's sort of the bigger picture of what's happening here. What is the end goal of Ukraine is peace, restoration of territory, and rebuilding their economy. What is the end goal of the Russian president is the opposite, is continued destabilization. And I don't know what his ultimate long-term goal is, because a year ago when Crimea was invaded, the international community said, terrible thing, but well, maybe we just need to accept this. Now violence is in the east, and if you follow what's been happening in Ukraine, there have been attacks in other cities, like Kharkiv, like Dnipropetrovsk, like Zaporizhia, like Odessa. It's not being contained in that map zone that we saw on the screen.
Well, let me push back a little bit here, because I think, Nina, we have some sense about what the long-range game for Russia is here. We certainly know they want a Ukraine that is not part of NATO. They want a neutral Ukraine, and they'd certainly like a federated eastern part of Ukraine as part of Russia's sphere of influence. I mean, that's right, isn't it?
Oh, that is absolutely right. And I think actually, as sad as it is, Putin is probably going to get it, because Petro Poroshenko needs to build his country, even if there are pieces of it is bitten out by Russia, if not necessarily officially, except for Crimea. I think that Martha is right, and this conflict would probably be even going further into Ukrainian territory. I think Mariupol, another very important port, would probably be then the next flare of, before the next ceasefire happens, the next flare of Putin's influence. So this is indeed the case, but I don't really know whether it can be solved other than having international community try to negotiate with Putin, as horrible as the solution may be for Ukraine and for the international community, because war in Europe is a worse possibility, worse scenario than that.
In which case, Nina, since we understand what Russia's long game is here, what do you see as Ukraine's long game?
Well, it seems to me, I mean, I think Martha put it very well, is that, Poroshenko needs to start building the country. He needs peace, he needs stability, and he is really not a war president. I mean, Putin is much more of a warmonger president, not Poroshenko. Poroshenko is a brilliant businessman, and I think that's how Ukraine would benefit, is that he can make it work the way he made work his businesses. So he desperately needs this peace, as bad as this peace is, and in some ways it seems to me that he's almost accepting the Putin terms as long as he can move on with his business development, economic development of his country, which of course the West, the United States, Canada, Europe should absolutely 150% be helpful of.
Well, that is the big question. I noticed the new foreign minister for Canada said today there are more sanctions coming. He didn't specify today, but he said there are more sanctions coming. But, I mean, is the reality here at some point, Marta, that Ukraine is going to have to accept the way it is? As much as you may not like it, but that's the reality.
Well, here's the historian in me coming out. And that proposal has been put on the table in regards to Crimea, in regards to eastern Ukraine, and that certainly is a possibility. But let's remember what happened in 1938. When there was another leader of another country who was aggressively pursuing territory in a neighboring state, presenting various arguments of protecting nationals of a similar nation, and Western democratic leaders met in Munich and said, well, if we let him take that territory, maybe he'll stop. And of course, a year later, it went on.
The world was at war.
So
It's always hard. You know,
I mean, history
it's
doesn't
dangerous.
always repeat itself.
I was just going to say, Marty, you got to be careful when you play the Hitler card, right?
It's very difficult to know, how do you stop someone who is clearly pursuing an aggressive agenda? I mean, it's like a bully in a playground. There are different ways to try to stop aggressive behavior. And usually what happens in the playground is the teacher comes out and says, okay, stop the fighting, separate the warring factions, make sure the aggression is contained, the smaller person is okay, and then some sort of settlement is reached. The international arena is not a playground, and there's no teacher to come and separate the warring parties. So, I mean, the equivalent is, you know, the bully has beaten up somebody, so, well, okay, we'll just let that happen and hope that it stops there.
Well, again, okay, Nina, let me ask you about the teacher in this case, who if I'm going to extend the metaphor here, is the United States, because there are certainly elements in the United States who would like to see much more lethal weaponry delivered to Ukraine in order to help it push back against Russian aggression. How does any of what's transpired over the last 5 days, do you think, affect those efforts to make those weapons deliveries?
Well, it has, I'm sure it will affect. I mean, the conversation died down for a bit just because there was an idea that diplomacy should be given a chance, and now I'm sure the conversation will flare up again, will start all over again. I think it's a big mistake because Putin doesn't back down. He's not going to back down. He actually would rather take his country with him, down with him, than to stop. And making him do that probably is not necessarily a good idea. I don't want to play the Hitler card. I think it's there's a different political circumstances with different countries that we're talking about. And so Putin does have certain international appetites close to his heart, which is New Russia, the Novorossiya. But I would see these parts that are being taken by the rebels right now closer to the Transnistria in Moldova development rather than the Hitler expansion of Europe. Transnistria in Moldova is a Russian-controlled territory. I would see it this way rather than thinking that it's going to be the new war in Europe and the world needs to step in immediately to stop it, because I think it actually, the lethal delivery of weapons would probably be the beginning of war rather than the end of it.
We got a couple of minutes left here, and let me get one more item on the table here, and that is there are always questions about how independent these rebels are, whether they're taking direction from Russia, how influential Russia is being on them, and so on and so forth. What's transpired over the last few days, Marta, that would give you any more clarity on that issue?
Well, I don't think anything dramatic has changed over the last few days. And I think this is part of what people are calling the information war, that initially there was this deniability that this is something that's happening within Ukraine. And the first leader of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, Igor Strelkov, who was later dismissed, has gone on the record saying that not only is he a Russian citizen, but he was given the order to go in there and start all of this.
Did he say by whom?
Well, yes.
From the top?
Yes. Well, I don't know that he said it was Putin, but he had orders from his commanders to go in there and start. But I think the real question now is how do we stop this? And I don't know that I would advocate arming one side or the other. What I would advocate is peacekeeping forces going in there and separating the two sides.
There doesn't seem to be a peace to keep at the moment, though.
Well, I mean, that's the problem with the international order as it is. When you have a conflict like this, there are very few instruments to actually stop the fighting, because the majority of the population of Ukraine just wants this to stop. We don't have reliable public opinion polls in Russia, but my guess would be that most Russians want this to stop as well. And the first step is to actually stop the fighting.
Nina,
not continue arming, but to de-escalate.
I want to save a minute for Nina here. Just in our last minute, Nina, tell us what you think can be done at this point.
I think more negotiations. I think it was a mistake that Debaltseve was never brought in the Minsk II agreement. It should have been discussed. And I think it would be very useful of Hollande and Merkel to go back to Moscow perhaps, or at least have conversations with Putin every day to discuss exactly the sticking points about the constitutional changes, about federalization, about NATO, and about Debaltseve, about those lines and how you really make the rebels stop. I think they have some leverage to press on Putin, and I think they should be using that.
Okay. My thanks to you both for coming in and helping us out with this tonight. Nina Khrushcheva from the World Policy Institute. She joined us via Skype from New York City. Marta Ditchok, Professor of History, Political Science, Western University in London, joining us here in our Toronto studios. Thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.